Today, we're going to talk about five ways to practice and demonstrate diligence. What does this mean for the nonprofit director or officer? Well, it really means taking the right actions to fulfill your fiduciary duties. Before we dive into the topic, I just have a few definitions here that we're going to work with during this short video. So, first of all, as a nonprofit director or officer, what's an obligation? So let's define this together as an obligation is something that goes beyond responsibility in a contractual or legal sense. What it means for a nonprofit director or officer, it refers to formal requirements that you, as a person, must meet under agreements, regulations, or ethical or legal standards. In this case, let's refer to the nonprofit law under which you are incorporated. For example, if your organization is incorporated in Ontario, it would be ONCA. If your organization is incorporated federally as a nonprofit, the federal law would be the one which applies here. And in any event, what is an obligation? It's a binding commitment, which means that failure to meet those binding commitments can have consequences. What I'm trying to say here in a non-threatening manner, of course, is as a nonprofit director or officer, you have obligations, binding commitments, of which one of them is diligence. So ultimately, an obligation is what's required to do to comply. So, what you must do as a director or an officer of a nonprofit organization. So, that's an obligation, your must do's or your non negotiable tasks. I also want to quickly define what is a fiduciary and what is a fiduciary duty. The fiduciary duty refers to who you're doing it for. A person or an organization is considered a fiduciary when they hold or manage assets or interests on behalf of someone else based on a relationship of trust. In the case of a nonprofit director or officer, you are fiduciary to this organization, which means you are expected to manage the organization or oversee the management of the organization in a respectful and trustworthy, responsible manner. This fiduciary duty includes a legal and ethical duty to manage the assets, the organization's assets and interests, with high levels of care and loyalty. What are some of the fiduciary obligations of board members? Well, board members, as you probably already know, have legal and ethical duties to act in the best interest of the nonprofit. These fiduciary duties are based on the principles of loyalty, diligence, and transparency. And they are similar to standards applied to directors of private or public corporations, for example. So, what are some of those fiduciary obligations? What are some of those duties, those obligations that you have as a nonprofit director or officer? Well, the first one is the duty of care. The law requires you, as a nonprofit director or officer, to act with care, competence, and diligence, the same that a reasonably prudent person would exercise in similar circumstances. But really, what does that mean for a nonprofit director or officer? Well, it means, among other things, staying informed. It means learning about the organization's affairs. It means reviewing financial documents and reports. It means understanding the principal risks of board decisions when you are asked to make some or one. It also means participate actively. When you're elected to sit on a board of a nonprofit, you're also expected to be there. You are exercising your duty of care, legal duty of care, legal obligation here, when you attend board activities and when you contribute meaningfully to discussions and decisions. That's what you were elected to do. You are also exercising your duty of care as a board director or officer when you're ensuring legal compliance or when you ensure legal compliance, making sure the organization complies to all applicable laws, whether they be tax laws, environmental laws, or other regulations, and also, of course, its own bylaws and internal policies. So these are just a few examples to get us in the groove here of what it means for a director or an officer to exercise their duty of care. I also want to define what is due diligence because I'm going to go into 5 ways of practicing and demonstrating your diligence. So let's define together what the law expects of us in terms of due diligence. So due diligence, let's remember, is a legal and ethical concept which refers to the duty to act with the level of care, caution, and responsibility that is expected from a reasonable person under similar circumstances. This concept of due diligence, you've probably heard of it before. It's often applied to board members and or executives or officers, including, of course, nonprofit organizations. And it is there to ensure that these directors and officers carry out their duties thoughtfully and always in the best interest of the organization. So what does it mean to practice and demonstrate due diligence? Well, practicing due diligence is the ability, of directors and officers to adopt behaviors that enable them to meet legal requirements while making the best possible decisions for the organization's well-being. All of this free from external influence. Let's remember the importance of declaring a conflict of interest if you have one. Why? Because according to your duty of care, you are supposed to act with due diligence, which means making the best possible decisions for the organization free from external influence. So if there was a board decision that maybe you are not entitled to make because it involves you personally, or for example, a personal family member, or for example, you can benefit from it monetarily, of course, then you might not act free from external influence. You could be influenced by an external position or situation of yours. So you should recuse yourself from that decision. You should declare your conflict of interest and not participate. So due diligence, let's remember, making the best possible decisions for the organization without external influence. And then what is demonstrating due diligence? Because the rest of my little video today will be based on practicing and demonstrating due diligence. So when we talk about demonstrating due diligence, we're talking about the organization's ability to provide evidence and operate in a way that allows it to show to authorities, to auditor, to other stakeholders, or to a court that it is acting or that it acted with due diligence. So there's practicing due diligence and demonstrating due diligence. So how do you do that as a director or an officer? Well, here's one way to practice due diligence. It's asking questions about reports and key issues. And how do you demonstrate? Well, you record in the minutes that board members and officers asked questions and or held discussions before making a decision. So a way to practice due diligence is to ask questions about reports and key issues, and you demonstrate that diligence by recording in the minutes, for example, that board members asked questions, that this issue was debated, and that various themes around the decision themes around the decision were addressed and that questions were asked. This is demonstrating your diligence as a board director or officer. Another way to practice your diligence is to encourage open debate during meetings. How do you demonstrate this? By ensuring that any issue requiring a decision is supported by documentation. So whether it be reports, executive summaries, could be articles, could be professional or legal advice, anything. And the other thing is to ensure that there's sufficient preparation time. So before you make a decision as a board member, as a director or an officer, it's making sure that the decisions that you are being asked to make are supported by documentation and that you have received said documentation ahead of time so that you're able to prepare. Another way to practice your diligence is to assign committees to conduct detailed work on behalf of the board. Really, really useful to go into the amount of detail that you usually don't have time to go into around the board table. So a way to practice diligence is to assign committees to conduct detailed work on behalf of the board. Look at a question in much detail and then recommend a course of action to the board. How do you demonstrate that diligence? Well, by create standing committees, the most common being your finance committee, your governance committee, and your compensation committee, this being the executive director evaluation and compensation committee. So create standing committees with specific mandates that are outlined in your governance policies. And of course, ensure that just as for your board meetings, your committee meetings have minutes and that these minutes are recorded and filed. And by recorded, I don't mean recording, like pressing record, but I mean that minutes are present, that they are there, that they are approved by the committee, and that they explain what the committee did in their meeting, and probably also document the recommendations that the committee are bringing forth to the board. So a fourth way to practice due diligence here as a director or officer of a nonprofit is to regularly review and update your governance documents. We're talking about your key governance documents here, your policies, your bylaws, your statutes. How do you demonstrate that diligence? Well, by including, for example, in your documents, the adoption date, the revision history of all of these documents, and also the revision schedule. For example, our bylaws are reviewed annually. Well, put that in the footer or the header of the document. There's also another way that you can demonstrate diligence here when it comes to regularly reviewing and updating your key governance documentation, and it's seeking professional advice when needed. For example, on accounting principles, when you're talking about financial policies or your governance standards, or generally accepted HR practices when it comes to your HR policies. And last but not least, another way to practice your diligence as a nonprofit director or officer is to ensure optimal attendance at board and committee meetings. And how do you demonstrate this diligence? Well, by documenting board and executive attendance and meeting minutes, and by adopting a governance calendar to maximize participation, by planning dates much in advance. A good governance calendar will allow you to let every director and officer know way ahead of time when are the next meetings going to be, so that everyone at the beginning of a governance cycle can go into their calendar, put the dates in, and therefore you're maximizing your chances of having everyone around the board table when decisions are being made. So here were 4 ways to practice and demonstrate your diligence as a director or officer of a nonprofit organization.